The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the briefing room at Pensacola Naval Air Station as Jonah Mitchell clutched her worn leather folder against her chest. At 24 years old and barely 5'4", her small frame seemed even tinier surrounded by the towering presence of Captain Marcus Wellington and his team of flight instructors. Their military bearing filled the sterile room with an aura of absolute authority, the smell of jet fuel and metal polish hanging in the air. A constant reminder that this was a place where only the elite belonged, where dreams took flight or crashed and burned without ceremony. Captain Wellington stood 6'7", his broad shoulders stretching the fabric of his flight suit as he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed like a fortress wall. His steel-gray eyes swept over Jonah with a kind of dismissive glance reserved for lost tourists who had wandered into restricted areas. Lieutenant Brad Morrison sat beside him, younger but equally imposing, his lips already curling into the sort of smirk that had crushed countless hopefuls before they even opened their mouths. The third man, Staff Sergeant Mike Torres, remained silent but watchful, his weathered hands folded on the table like he was waiting for an execution. So, Captain Wellington began, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years in military aviation. The it girl wants to play pilot. He emphasized the word girl with just enough condescension to make it sting without crossing any official lines. His laugh was deep and resonant, the kind that echoed off hangar walls and made grown men feel small. Tell me, Miss Mitchell, what makes you think you belong in a cockpit instead of behind a computer screen where you're supposed to be? Jonah's fingers tightened around her folder, but her voice remained steady as mountain stone. I have my private pilot license, sir, and my commercial rating. She opened the folder with deliberate care, revealing certificates that looked almost fragile under the harsh lights. I've logged 437 hours of flight time, including complex aircraft and instrument conditions. I believe I meet the minimum requirements for the V-22 Osprey training program. Lieutenant Morrison leaned forward, his chair creaking like old bones. Minimum requirements? His voice dripped with mock surprise. Honey, we're not running a summer camp here. The V-22 Osprey weighs 15 tons when loaded, carries a crew of 4, and costs $70 million. It's not some little Cessna you can take up for weekend joyrides. He gestured broadly, his hands painting the picture of something far beyond her comprehension. This is military aviation, where one mistake doesn't just end your career, it ends lives. The words hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft, heavy and acrid. Jonah felt the familiar burn of dismissal, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times when people looked at her small stature and soft voice and decided she wasn't worth their serious consideration. But this time was different. This time, she had spent 2 years analyzing every flight pattern, every training record, every failure report that crossed the base's computer systems. Actually, sir, she said, her voice gaining strength like an engine warming up, I've been analyzing the training data, and I've noticed some significant discrepancies in the route of honor protocol. The words fell into the room like grenades with their pins pulled. The failure rate is 73%, which suggests either the pilots are inadequately prepared, or there's a systematic issue with the route itself. Captain Wellington's face changed color, shifting from casual dismissal to something far more dangerous. He stood slowly, his full height casting a shadow across the table like a storm cloud blocking the sun. The route of honor is classified information, Miss Mitchell. How exactly does an IT technician gain access to classified training data? His voice had dropped to a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout could have managed. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of aircraft engines and the steady tick of the wall clock marking seconds like a countdown to disaster. Jonah could feel the weight of their stares, could sense the shift from amusement to genuine hostility. She had crossed a line, and everyone in the room knew it. Server maintenance gives you access to interesting files, sir, she replied with the calm of someone who had nothing left to lose. When you're responsible for backing up flight simulation data and training records, patterns become apparent. Statistical anomalies tend to stand out, especially when they've been consistent for 3 years running. Lieutenant Morrison shot to his feet, his chair sliding backward with a harsh scrape. Are you telling us that you've been snooping through classified military files? Do you have any idea what kind of federal charges that could bring? His voice rose with each word, filling the small room with righteous indignation and barely controlled anger. But it was Captain Wellington who delivered the final blow, his words precise and final as a court-martial verdict. Miss Mitchell, you are way out of line and way out of your depth. Not only are you unqualified to be in this room, but you've apparently been conducting unauthorized access to classified information. He pointed toward the door with the authority of a man who had never been questioned and never been wrong. I want you out of this briefing room, off this proposal, and if I hear so much as a whisper that you've been discussing classified information with anyone, I'll have you brought up on charges so fast it'll make your head spin. Jonah closed her folder with careful deliberation, her movements controlled and precise despite the trembling in her hands. She stood slowly, maintaining eye contact with Captain Wellington for just a moment longer than protocol would suggest. Understood, sir, she said quietly. But the data doesn't lie, and neither do the families of the pilots who've crashed trying to complete that route. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything she had worked toward. But as Jonah walked down the corridor past the photos of distinguished pilots and the gleaming trophies of aerial achievement, her mind was already moving to the next phase of her plan. She wasn't going home to a small apartment to nurse her wounded pride. Instead, she was driving straight to a place that Captain Wellington couldn't even imagine. A place where the one person who had ever completed the route of honor was waiting to help her prove that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. The gravel crunched under Jonah's tires as she pulled up to the weathered trailer that sat like a forgotten memory on the outskirts of Pensacola. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird called out with borrowed songs. This was where Russell McKenna lived now, far from the pristine hangars where he had once been a legend. The trailer door opened before Jonah could knock, revealing a man who looked like he had been carved from old leather and weathered steel. Russ McKenna was 52 years old, but the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw made him look older, a permanent reminder of the crash that had ended his official flying career 5 years ago. His gray hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and his clothes were stained with engine oil and honest dirt. Let me guess, he said, his voice rough as sandpaper but warm with genuine amusement. Wellington showed you the door. It wasn't a question. Russ had been expecting this conversation ever since Jonah had first approached him 18 months ago, seeking flight instruction from someone who existed outside the military's rigid hierarchy. The interior of the trailer was cramped but organized, with aviation charts covering one wall and a flight simulator setup occupying one corner. Books on aerodynamics sat stacked on every available surface, their pages yellow with age and heavy use. This was the workshop of a man who loved flying more than life itself, even after it had nearly killed him. Same arrogance that crushed 3 birds and killed 2 good pilots. Russ continued, settling into a worn chair. Marcus Wellington is a fine pilot. I'll give him that. But he's got the kind of pride that makes men believe their own press releases. When someone like you comes along with actual data, it threatens everything he thinks he knows about himself. Jonah sat across from him, finally allowing the tension to drain from her shoulders. He called me unqualified, she said, the words still stinging. Said I belonged behind a computer screen, not in a cockpit. Unqualified? Russ's laugh was bitter. You've got more actual flying time than half his instructors had when they started teaching. The difference is, you learn to fly because you love it, not because someone told you it would make you special. He stood and walked to the wall of charts, pointing to a route marked in red ink. This is the route of honor. I designed this route, Jonah. The room grew quiet except for the hum of the ancient air conditioner. Jonah stared at the route, seeing for the first time the full complexity of what she had only encountered in computer files and statistical reports. "I completed this route exactly once," Russ continued, his finger tracing the red line. "October of 2019. Perfect weather conditions, and I barely made it. But here's what nobody wants to acknowledge. The route is based on weather patterns from 2018. Since then, the seasonal wind patterns have shifted, the temperature gradients are different, and what was challenging but achievable has become nearly impossible." Jonah felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "That's why the failure rate is so high," she said, her voice rising with excitement. "It's not that the pilots aren't skilled enough. It's that they're flying a route designed for atmospheric conditions that no longer exist." "Exactly," Russ said, turning back to face her with pride in his weathered features. "I tried to tell them. Filed report after report, showed them the meteorological data. But admitting the route was flawed would mean admitting that 3 years of training had been based on faulty assumptions. So they buried my reports and buried me with them." The weight of this revelation settled over Jonah like a heavy blanket. She thought about the pilots who had failed the route, the careers that had been ended, the confidence that had been shattered by what they believe was their own inadequacy. But more than that, she thought about the demonstration flight scheduled for the following week. The one where Captain Wellington would showcase the route of honor to a gathering of military brass, civilian contractors, and carefully selected media representatives. "He's planning a public demonstration," she said, her voice tight with concern. "Next Tuesday. Full media coverage, defense contractors, the works. He wants to prove once and for all that the route of honor is the ultimate test of pilot excellence." Russ's expression darkened. In current atmospheric conditions, he'll be flying into a death trap with cameras rolling. The man's ego is going to get him killed, and it'll take the entire training program down with him. Jonah felt something crystallize inside her, a clarity that cut through months of uncertainty and self-doubt. "I want to prove them wrong," she said, her voice steady with newfound purpose. "Not just about me, but about everything. The route, the training program, the whole assumption that flying is about conquering the sky instead of understanding it." Russ smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked like the legendary test pilot he had once been. "Then we're going to need access to a V-22 Osprey," he said simply, "and I know exactly who owes me that favor." The plan they developed over the next 3 hours was audacious in its simplicity. While Wellington performed his demonstration for the assembled crowd, Jonah would conduct her own flight using real-time atmospheric data and the corrected route parameters that Russ had been trying to get approved for 3 years. 2 aircraft, 2 approaches, and undeniable proof of which method actually worked. "There's no going back from this," Russ warned as they finalized the details. "If you're wrong, if something goes wrong, they'll crucify you. Court-martial, federal charges, the works. Your flying career will be over before it really begins." Jonah looked at the charts spread across the table, at the data that painted such a clear picture of institutional failure disguised as maintaining standards. "If I'm right," she said quietly, "how many pilots' careers will we save? How many lives?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge to the universe itself. Outside the trailer, the Florida sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, the same sky that would soon become either her vindication or her destruction. The morning of the demonstration dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect visibility that made flying look deceptively simple. At Pensacola Naval Air Station, the assembled crowd represented the cream of military aviation, colonels with decades of flight experience, defense contractors worth billions of dollars, and journalists who specialized in writing about American military superiority. They stood in the shadow of the massive hangar where gleaming V-22 Osprey waited like a technological marvel, ready to prove its worthiness. Captain Wellington moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his confidence radiating like heat from summer asphalt. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the tarmac without need for amplification, What you're about to witness represents the pinnacle of military pilot training. The Route of Honor isn't just a flight path. It's a crucible that separates those who merely think they can fly from those who truly understand what it means to be masters of the sky. 20 miles away, in a secure hangar that didn't appear on any public maps, Jonah was conducting her own kind of preparation. The building was filled with equipment that existed in gray areas between official military operations and private contractors, where favors were traded like currency and certain questions were never asked. The V-22 Osprey that waited for her was identical to Wellington's. But this aircraft carried the weight of different expectations. Russ McKenna stood beside her, his scarred hands checking systems with the obsessive attention to detail that had once made him the military's most trusted test pilot. "Remember," he said quietly, "this isn't about proving you're a better pilot than Wellington. This is about proving that understanding trumps arrogance every single time." Jonah's monitoring equipment filled a corner of the hangar, screens showing real-time atmospheric conditions, wind patterns, and pressure gradients that told the story Wellington couldn't see from his cockpit. The data streaming across her monitors painted a picture of sky conditions that looked perfect to the naked eye, but contained subtle variations that would challenge even the most experienced pilot. "He's flying into conditions that match the historical average perfectly," she murmured to Russ, her voice tight with concentration. "Temperature, humidity, wind speed. Everything looks exactly like what the training simulations predict. But the actual patterns are completely different." Russ muttered grimly. "The atmosphere doesn't care about historical averages," he said. "It only cares about what's happening right now." Wellington is about to learn the difference between flying by the book and flying by reality. Back at the main base, Wellington was climbing into his cockpit with fluid grace. The familiar smell of leather and electronics filled his nostrils, and the soft hum of systems coming online was like a lullaby that promised performance would silence his critics forever. He ran through his pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision, each item verified according to procedures refined through years of experience. "Control, this is Steel 1 requesting clearance for Route of Honor demonstration." Wellington's voice crackled through the radio with absolute confidence. The words were routine, but the weight they carried was enormous. This flight would either validate everything he had built or expose him to questions he wasn't prepared to answer. "Steel 1, you are cleared for Route of Honor approach. Weather conditions are optimal. Winds are within acceptable parameters for all phases of flight." The controller's voice was professional and calm, but everyone listening knew that optimal was a relative term when it came to the Route of Honor. As Wellington's V-22 lifted off with thunderous roar, the crowd watched with the reverent attention usually reserved for religious ceremonies. The aircraft rose vertically like a helicopter before the nacelles began their rotation to convert it into forward flight. A transformation that never failed to impress, representing the cutting edge of military technology. But in her hidden hangar, Jonah was watching different displays, screens that showed the real-time atmospheric conditions Wellington was flying into, conditions that looked perfect on paper, but contained the seeds of his inevitable failure. "It's starting," she said to Russ, her fingers flying across her tablet as she initiated her own pre-flight sequence. "Time to show them what happens when you listen to what the sky is actually telling you." The first sign of trouble came as a slight tremor in Captain Wellington's voice, so subtle that only the most experienced listeners would have noticed the hairline crack in his usual confidence. "Control, Steel 1 experiencing some unexpected turbulence in Sector 7, he reported, his words carefully measured to avoid suggesting anything more serious than routine flight conditions. But in the cockpit of the V-22 Osprey, Wellington's hands were working harder than they should have been, making constant micro-adjustments to maintain the precise flight path that the Route of Honor demanded. The assembled crowd continued to watch with rapt attention, unaware that the man they had come to see demonstrate perfection was fighting a battle against atmospheric conditions that didn't match any simulation or training scenario in their extensive database. The V-22 looked magnificent against the blue Florida sky, its twin rotors cutting through the air with mechanical precision. But Wellington could feel the aircraft responding differently than every training flight had prepared him for. "Turbulence is increasing," he reported again, this time unable to completely mask the strain in his voice. The route of honor required split-second timing through a series of increasingly complex maneuvers, each one building on the last like movements in a deadly symphony. But the wind patterns he was encountering seemed to shift unpredictably, creating pockets of instability where his training had promised smooth air. 20 miles away, Jonah watched her monitoring equipment with the focused intensity of a surgeon watching vital signs during a critical operation. Every sensor she had quietly installed in the base's weather monitoring system was feeding her real-time data about conditions that Wellington was experiencing but couldn't fully understand. The numbers told a story that was both fascinating and terrifying. Atmospheric conditions that appeared perfect on paper but contained subtle variations that made precision flying exponentially more difficult. "Look at this," she said to Russ, pointing to a display showing wind shear patterns. "The vertical wind gradients are varying by 15 to 20 knots every few hundred feet. That's completely different from the steady-state conditions the route was designed for." Her voice carried the excitement of discovery mixed with genuine concern for the pilot who was struggling through conditions no one had prepared him for. Russ studied the data with the kind of grin recognition that comes from hard-earned experience. "He's flying blind," he said quietly. "All this training, all this confidence, it's based on assumptions about atmospheric conditions that simply don't exist today. He's not failing because he's a bad pilot. He's failing because he's trying to fly a route that was designed for a different sky." Back in the cockpit, Wellington was discovering the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical reality in the most visceral way possible. The V-22 Osprey was responding to his inputs, but with a delay and unpredictability that made precision maneuvering feel like trying to thread a needle while riding a roller coaster. Each gust of wind seemed to come from a different direction than his instruments predicted, and the aircraft's computer systems were providing guidance based on atmospheric models that no longer matched reality. "Control, Steel 1 requesting permission to modify approach vector," Wellington finally admitted, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. For a pilot of his caliber, requesting a modification mid-flight was tantamount to admitting weakness, but the alternative was risking the kind of catastrophic failure that would end careers and potentially lives. The radio silence that followed his request seemed to stretch for hours, though it was probably only seconds. Everyone listening, the crowd, the controllers, the military brass who had staked their reputations on this demonstration, understood that what they were witnessing was not the triumphant validation they had expected, but something much more complicated and potentially embarrassing. "Steel 1, modification approved. Recommend you abort final approach sequence and return to standard landing pattern," came the eventual response from the control tower. The words were delivered in the flat, professional tone that military personnel used when they wanted to avoid acknowledging the full implications of what was happening. Wellington's hands moved across his controls with the mechanical precision of someone following emergency procedures, but his mind was racing with questions and implications that threatened to undermine everything he thought he knew about flying. The route of honor was supposed to be challenging but achievable for pilots of his caliber. The fact that he was struggling suggested either a fundamental flaw in his own abilities or a problem with the route itself. And Wellington's ego wouldn't allow him to consider the former possibility. "Steel 1 on final approach for emergency landing," he announced, his voice now stripped of its earlier confidence. The words emergency landing sent a ripple through the watching crowd, transforming what was supposed to be a demonstration of superiority into a sobering reminder that even the most advanced aircraft and experienced pilots were subject to forces beyond their control. As Wellington's V-22 touched down with a jarring impact that suggested less than perfect control, Jonah was already airborne in her own Osprey, climbing steadily toward the route of honor's starting point. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. while the official demonstration had ended in emergency procedures and barely controlled failure, Research 7, as her aircraft was designated, was beginning its approach to the same route with calm professionalism. Control, this is Research 7 requesting clearance for route of honor approach. Jonah's voice came through the radio with steady confidence that carried across multiple frequencies, reaching not just the air traffic controllers, but also the assembled crowd who was still processing Wellington's unexpected difficulties. The silence that followed was electric. Everyone who heard the transmission understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented. A second aircraft attempting the route that had just defeated one of the military's most experienced pilots. In the debriefing hangar where Wellington sat trying to make sense of his failure, heads snapped up at the sound of Jonah's voice. "That's impossible," Lieutenant Morrison whispered, his face pale with realization. "Who authorized a second flight?" But Colonel James Parker, the base commander, was already moving toward the windows that overlooked the flight line. Through binoculars, he could see Research 7 approaching the route of honor's entry point with smooth, confident movements that suggested its pilot understood something the rest of them had missed. "Research 7, you are cleared for route of honor approach," came the controller's response, professional training overriding personal amazement. "Be advised that atmospheric conditions are challenging." In her cockpit, Jonah smiled grimly at the understatement. Her instruments showed her exactly what those challenging conditions looked like. Wind patterns that shifted like living things, pressure gradients that created invisible obstacles, and atmospheric variations that would have been impossible to predict using historical data. But she wasn't flying based on predictions. She was flying based on real-time information about what the sky was actually doing. "Research 7 entering Sector 7, she announced, her voice steady despite the fact that this was the section where most route of honor attempts failed. Where Wellington had encountered unexpected turbulence and fought against it, Jonah anticipated the atmospheric variations and worked with them, using wind patterns to assist her maneuvers rather than struggling against forces she couldn't predict. Her V-22 moved through the challenging airspace like water flowing around obstacles, smooth and efficient, because she understood the medium through which she was traveling. Where others had tried to conquer the sky through force and determination, she succeeded by listening to what it was telling her. Sector 7 complete. Proceeding to final approach sequence, she announced, her voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone whose careful preparation was being validated by results. The most challenging part of the route of honor lay ahead. The series of precision maneuvers that required split-second timing and perfect coordination between pilot and machine. In the base command center, a crowd had gathered around the radar displays, showing Research 7's progress through the route. Wellington stood among them, his professional pride warring with growing amazement as he watched someone accomplish what had just defeated him so completely. "How is she doing that?" he whispered, his military bearing unable to completely conceal his fascination with techniques he had never learned. Colonel Parker leaned forward, studying the radar display with the intensity of someone witnessing history being made. "She's not fighting the conditions," he observed quietly. "She's working with them. Every adjustment she makes seems to anticipate what the atmosphere is going to do next." The final approach sequence was a masterpiece of aeronautical precision, requiring the pilot to thread the aircraft through increasingly narrow atmospheric corridors while maintaining exact timing and perfect control. It was the kind of flying that demanded not just skill, but an almost mystical understanding of how aircraft and atmosphere interacted. "Research 7 beginning final approach sequence," Jonah announced, and for the first time since takeoff, her voice carried a hint of the intense concentration required for what she was attempting. But her instruments showed her exactly what the atmosphere was doing, and her careful analysis had prepared her for every variation the route could present. The V-22 moved through the final sequence with mechanical precision, each maneuver executed with the confidence that comes from complete understanding rather than hopeful guesswork. Where other pilots had encountered unexpected challenges and struggled to adapt, Jonah anticipated every atmospheric variation and adjusted her technique accordingly. "Route of honor complete," she finally announced, her voice carrying the quiet triumph of someone whose theories had been validated by practical results. Research 7 requesting clearance for landing approach. The words marked not just the completion of a challenging flight, but the vindication of an approach that prioritized understanding over tradition, analysis over assumption. Where others had fought the sky, she had listened to it, and in that listening, she had found the key to success that had eluded even the most experienced pilots in the military. The landing of Research 7 marked the beginning of a transformation that would ripple through military aviation training for years to come. Jonah climbed down from the V-22 Osprey with the same quiet competence she had displayed throughout the flight, her small frame belying the enormous significance of what she had just accomplished. The aircraft sat on the tarmac like a technological monument to the power of understanding over arrogance, its twin rotors still ticking as they cooled in the Florida afternoon heat. Colonel Parker arrived at the hangar within an hour, accompanied by Captain Wellington and a small group of senior officers who had heard whispers about an unauthorized flight that had somehow succeeded where official training missions had repeatedly failed. Their faces reflected the complex mixture of emotions that comes when institutional assumptions are challenged by undeniable results: curiosity, concern, and the kind of professional interest that emerges when people realize they might have been wrong about something important. "Miss Mitchell," Colonel Parker began, his voice carrying the formal tone that military officers used when they needed to maintain official protocol while acknowledging exceptional circumstances. "I understand you just completed the route of honor successfully. I'd like to hear your assessment of why you succeeded where others had encountered difficulties." His words were carefully chosen to avoid acknowledging that the military's training program might have been fundamentally flawed, but his expression suggested genuine interest in her analysis. Jonah stood beside the V-22, her hair still showing the effects of wearing a flight helmet, but her voice was steady and professional as she responded. "Colonel, the route itself isn't flawed. It's actually a brilliant piece of aeronautical design. The problem is that it was created for atmospheric conditions that existed in 2018. And those conditions have changed significantly due to regional climate variations and altered weather patterns in the Gulf of Mexico." She gestured toward the tablet she still carried, its screen displaying the real-time atmospheric data that had made her successful flight possible. "What I did differently wasn't flying better or harder. It was flying with accurate information about current conditions rather than historical assumptions about what conditions should be like. Every pilot who has attempted this route has been working with outdated environmental data, which is like trying to navigate with a map from a different city." Captain Wellington stepped forward, his military bearing intact, but his expression showing the kind of professional humility that comes when someone realizes they have learned something important. "Miss Mitchell, I owe you an apology," he said, his voice carrying genuine respect rather than the dismissive tone he had used in their first encounter. "I was wrong about your qualifications, wrong about your intentions, and wrong about the nature of the challenges we've been facing." The words hung in the afternoon air like a peace treaty being negotiated between former enemies who had discovered they were actually fighting the same battle. Wellington's admission carried weight because it came from someone whose professional reputation was built on never being wrong about aviation matters, and everyone present understood the significance of his acknowledgement. More importantly, Wellington continued, "You've identified a systematic problem that we should have caught years ago. If our training program has been based on outdated environmental assumptions, then we've been setting our pilots up for failure while telling ourselves we were maintaining high standards." His voice carried the bitter recognition that good intentions and institutional pride had created a situation where competent pilots were failing unnecessarily. Colonel Parker nodded slowly, his expression reflecting the kind of command decision-making that comes when operational reality collides with established procedure. "Miss Mitchell, I'm prepared to offer you a position as a civilian contractor specializing in environmental analysis for flight training programs." Your work here suggests that we need someone who can bridge the gap between atmospheric science and practical aviation training. But it was Russ McKenna who provided the perspective that would ultimately shape how this discovery was implemented throughout the military aviation community. He emerged from the hangar where he had been monitoring the flight, his scarred face showing the satisfaction of someone whose professional vindication had finally arrived after years of professional exile. "Colonel," Russ said, his voice carrying the authority that comes from decades of experience and hard-won wisdom, "what Miss Mitchell has demonstrated isn't just about fixing one training route. It's about changing how we think about the relationship between pilots and the environment they fly through. We've been teaching people to conquer the sky when we should have been teaching them to understand it." The conversation that followed would later be remembered as the moment when military aviation training began to shift from a culture of domination to a philosophy of cooperation, from assumption-based flying to data-driven flight operations. Within 6 months, the route of honor would be completely redesigned using current atmospheric models, and the success rate would improve from 27% to 94%. Captain Wellington would become one of the most vocal advocates for incorporating real-time environmental analysis into flight training, his conversion from skeptic to supporter lending credibility to reforms that might otherwise have been dismissed as the complaints of outsiders. His willingness to acknowledge error and embrace change would earn him respect throughout the aviation community, and eventually lead to his promotion to a position where he could implement similar reforms across multiple training programs. But perhaps the most significant change was in the culture of military aviation itself, where Jonah's quiet success had demonstrated that the most dangerous assumptions were often the ones that went unquestioned for years. Her story became part of training curricula, not as an example of individual heroism, but as a reminder that institutional humility and continuous learning were more valuable than traditional pride and rigid adherence to established procedures. Standing on the tarmac as the sun set over Pensacola Naval Air Station, Jonah felt the satisfaction that comes from proving a point without needing to humiliate anyone in the process. She had never wanted to embarrass Captain Wellington or damage the military's training programs. She had simply wanted to solve a problem that was causing unnecessary failures and potentially dangerous situations. "You know what the most interesting part of this whole experience has been?" she said to Colonel Parker as they watched the V-22 being prepared for its return to official service. "It wasn't about proving I could fly as well as anyone else. It was about proving that listening carefully and analyzing thoroughly can be just as important as courage and skill." Her words would be remembered long after the details of her flight were forgotten, becoming part of the institutional memory that would guide military aviation training for decades to come. Sometimes the most profound changes begin not with dramatic confrontations or public humiliations, but with quiet competence and the patient accumulation of irrefutable evidence. The revolution Jonah Mitchell started wasn't fought with raised voices or dramatic gestures, but with careful analysis and the kind of persistent, methodical work that transforms institutions from within. And perhaps that was the most powerful lesson of all, that true change often comes not from those who shout the loudest, but from those who listen most carefully to what the world is actually trying to tell them. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. What challenges in your own life have you conquered by refusing to accept that's just how things are? Have you ever been underestimated because of your appearance or background, only to prove everyone wrong? Share your stories of quiet triumph in the comments. Your experience might inspire someone else to take that first brave step toward proving their worth.